Hello, philosophers. Welcome back to another edition of Intro to Philosophy. So in this section of the class, if you've kept up with the online lectures, we've talked about René Descartes, and then we talked about J.P. Moreland, right? And there was a lot to digest in both of those lectures. But what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the position of dualism and the problem that dualism faces, and whether or not that problem is so serious that maybe we should abandon dualism entirely. So, what is dualism? Well, dualism is the position that J.P. Moreland called substance dualism. People normally just call it dualism. If they mean property dualism, they specify property dualism. So dualism is the position that Moreland calls the official doctrine. Dualism is the belief that the mind and the body are two separate things, and that the non-physical mind controls or drives the physical body. So this was a position that was argued for by René Descartes. You probably remember that from the Descartes lecture. Descartes thought that since I can imagine that my body doesn't exist, but I can't imagine that my mind doesn't exist, he thinks that there's no way for me to deny that my mind exists because something must be having an experience. So I know my mind exists. I don't necessarily know or can't be absolutely certain that my body exists. Descartes took it that the mind and the body must be two separate substances, and that everybody, all human beings consist of these two substances. One is the physical substance, that's your body, including your brain, and also there is your non-physical substance. This is goes by a few different names. Descartes was a Christian. He was fine with calling it your soul, but it is your consciousness. It is your self. It is it's who you are, right? Your experiences, right? And Descartes thought that this had to be this consciousness had to be a non-physical thing, right? And and the non-physical mind somehow controls or drives the physical body. How does this work? Well, that's a great question. In fact, it's one of the greatest questions in the history of philosophy. One of the most difficult and intractable questions in the history of philosophy, and it has its own name. In fact, Descartes' writings on this topic gave birth to an entirely new wing of metaphysics. Dualism leads to what leads to what's called the mind-body problem. So the mind-body problem, you should definitely get this in your notes. This is actually going to be the central preoccupation of this entire section of the class. The mind-body problem, one of the most important questions in metaphysics, is the question, if the mind and the body are two separate things, as dualism says they are, then how do they interact? How does the non-physical mind control or drive the physical body? This is a real problem. Nobody has a great answer to this question. The worst answer to this question, I might have mentioned this in the Descartes lecture, the worst answer to this question comes from actually René Descartes himself. Descartes was aware of this problem in his own time. He was a man of letters. He wrote he had a lot of pen pals, right? One of them was Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. And she, in one of her letters, asked him, well, pray tell, Monsieur Descartes, how is it that a non-physical substance comes to interact with or have an effect upon a physical substance? How does that work? And Descartes' response was, well, it happens in the pineal gland, right? That's a little gland in the brain that tradition had said was the seat of the soul. So Descartes was not terribly interested in trying to figure this question out. He thought it was just details. Other people then pressed him on this issue, and he just became sort of increasingly annoyed with it. He had other things to worry about, right? Like, inventing algebra 2. So, but the mind-body problem becomes a huge issue after Descartes. It's one of the most important issues that comes out of Descartes' entire body of work. And philosophers after Descartes come up with all sorts of crazy, sometimes literally crazy, sometimes like sci-fi answers to how it is that the mind and the body interact with each other, right? So, as we talked about, or as you heard from in the Moreland lecture, Moreland considers a few different approaches to this question. Moreland is a dualist in the tradition of René Descartes. So he defended Cartesian dualism, right? And Moreland presented a couple of different alternatives that have arisen over the years to dualism, and he explained why he thinks they're no good, they're no bueno, throw them out. And he thinks that the problems, he talked about physicalism, also known as materialism, and he talked about property dualism, also known as epiphenomenalism. And Moreland thought that the problems of those two positions were so significant, so untenable, that the only reasonable response is old-fashioned dualism, a la Descartes. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is we are going to talk about the fact that despite what Moreland would have you to believe, that dualism is the only reasonable approach to the mind-body problem, Descartes' dualism has fallen way, way, way out of favor in the history of philosophy, especially in the 20th century. In fact, you are hard-pressed to find a working dualism these days, or a working dualist these days among philosophy staff, right? Moreland is writing in the 1980s, and he's already has an air of being, the last sane man in the world, right? He has a sense of being a dying breed, and he is. There, I'm telling you, are not a lot of dualists left. Now, this is interesting because dualism comes naturally to us as human beings. I mean, it's sort of the common sense position that most of us have, right? Dualism, we constantly think of ourselves as my mind being something separate from my body, right? If something something bad happens to me and I'm really traumatized, I don't say my brain is traumatized. I say that something bad happened to me. I have post-traumatic stress, right? We don't think of ourselves strictly as bodies, right? And our religion, all of our science fiction and fantasy literature are filled with dualists. Dualism is just sort of taken for granted. When you think about your soul leaving your body after you die, for instance, right? Or if you think that the soul is strong but the flesh is weak, well, this is committing us to dualism, to a form of dualism, right? If you've ever read a story where a mom and her daughter are struck by lightning and they switch bodies, right? The the mom's brain goes into the daughter's body and vice versa, Freaky Friday style, right? Well, that treats the mind as though it is something detachable from your physical brain, and you can put it somewhere else. Maybe you can put it in a computer, right? Yoda, famous dualist, what are we? We are not this crude matter. We are this thing of spirit, right? So, dualism comes very, very naturally to us as human beings. In some ways, we seem kind of hardwired to think of our self, our consciousness, as something separate from our physical body, right? Now, the considered position of most philosophers who think about this sort of stuff, particularly people who study the brain, and not just philosophers, but people who study the brain for a living, tend to laugh in the face of anybody who brings up dualism. I know from personal experience. I've had this face laughed in from a neuroscience student at WashU. We were at a party when I was in grad school. One of my one of the people in my philosophy department was dating a neuroscience student at WashU, and talk turned to dualism, and she laughed right in our faces, right? Because people who study the brain for a living think that you are your brain, period. Everything about you can be explained by the neurochemical brain, the neurochemistry in your brain. If you can't explain it with neurochemistry, if you can't explain it with different brain states, it's just fiction, right? People used to believe in evil spirits and goblins, and they used to explain why people got sick because, a witch gave them the evil eye, right? Well, a lot of people these days who study the brain for a living think that talk of mental states, of a non-physical mental states, non-physical mind is eventually going to go the way of talk of the evil eye or evil spirits, right? So dualism is in a major crisis, and we're going to talk about one of the major sources of that crisis today. Dualism in the era of neuropsychiatry in the late 1800s and early 20th century is facing a real crisis as we understand more and more the relationship between the physical brain, particularly the frontal lobes of the brain, and human personality that changes in brain states. Changes in the physical brain cause changes in your personality, right? This is a very familiar concept now. We're familiar with people who survive major head trauma, familiar with people who survive strokes and so on, and we realize they have changes in their personality. Well, how does this work if dualism is true? Who you are, your personality, ought to be something non-physical, right? How can changing your physical brain affect your non-physical mind any more than cutting your fingernails changes your non-physical mind, right? So dualism, despite its common sense appeal, it's facing a major crisis, and in the 20th century, and one of the most no qualification necessary. The most famous argument against dualism, the nail in the coffin for dualism, is Gilbert Ryle's very famous argument about category mistakes. And that's what we're going to talk about. That's going to be the first thing we talk about today. After that, we're going to talk about B.F. Skinner and what a physicalist model of mind, or a physicalist model of psychology might look like. So, first up, let's talk about Ryle and the end of dualism as we know it. Okay, so Ryle's argument is this. He thinks that Descartes, as smart as Descartes was, Descartes made a major error when he started talking about the difference between the mind and the body, and this error ended up being repeated and passed along from generation to generation. And Ryle thinks that he can diagnose what this error was. So, what's the problem? Well, Ryle says, in talking about Descartes' dualism, Ryle points out that, okay, let's talk about what dualism says about human beings. According to dualism, humans are both bodies and minds. We already talked about that, right? And what do we know about bodies? Well, we know about bodies, about physical things, that they act according to mechanical laws, right? They are observable. They are located in space. They have height and they have weight and they have all of the characteristics that we associate with physical things, right? Now, all of this was very obvious to René Descartes, who was a scientist and very interested in how it is that physical bodies move through space. When you make this split, now you have to say, well, what are minds? What characteristics do minds have? And Ryle thinks right here is the problem. Right here is where Descartes went wrong. Because when Descartes had to say something about what minds are, all Descartes did was he took everything that we know about bodies, everything that we can observe and measure about bodies, and he just negated it, right? So bodies are mechanical. They operate according to mechanical laws. What do minds do? Well, minds are non-mechanical. They do not act according to mechanical laws. Bodies are observable. Minds are not observable. Bodies are located in space. They have location. Minds, not located. Minds don't weigh anything. Have no weight. You can do this all day. You can say that bodies are located in time, right? They exist for a period of time and go out of existence. Minds are what? Timeless, right? So the point is that everything. So the only thing that Descartes can say about the characteristics of minds is that they're just the opposite of the physical characteristics of bodies, right? This leads to, this is a problem, this is an error, and it leads to a catastrophic fallacy. It leads to a special kind of fallacy that has a special kind of error in logic and error in thinking that Ryle thinks has a centuries-long footprint, right? What Descartes did here is he treats minds and bodies as though they are opposites, right? And to be opposites, you have to be of the same logical type of thing, right? Let me say something a little more about that. So Descartes treated minds and bodies as opposites. And to be opposites, you have to be of the same logical type of thing. So bear with me about what that means. What is the opposite of up? Down. Well, they're both directions. What is the opposite of black? Well, it's white. They're both shades, right? So you see how to be opposites, you have to be of the same kind of thing, right? And here's the error. Here's the problem that that arises. Ryle thinks that Descartes should not have treated the mind and the body as though they are of the same logical type of thing, but just opposites. He thinks that this is a special kind of logical fallacy that he calls a category mistake. A category mistake is when you confuse the logical type of thing and you attribute characteristics to that thing that it could not possibly have. We have characteristics and attributes based on what kind of thing we are, right? Jason is a human being, right? I could not, as a human being, I could not have the characteristic of being made of stone, right? Being made of stone is not the kind of thing not the kind of characteristic that a human being could have. A statue could have be made of stone, right? But a statue could not, not prepare a lecture on Descartes, right? So we have our certain characteristics based on what kind of thing we are, right? So so to be opposites, things must be the same logical type. Here are the notes on this. For this part, Descartes treated minds and bodies as opposites. To be opposites, things must be of the same logical type. And the mistake that Descartes makes here is he's committing what Ryle calls a category mistake. So you can write at the bottom, this leads to a category mistake. Write that at the bottom. Now, let's say something about category mistakes. Okay, so now let's have some fun with category mistakes. Imagine this. Imagine you have a cousin in town for the 4th of July weekend, and you're going to have a big weekend, you're going to have a cookout, right? And your cousin, he struggled. He's had some mental problems that he's overcome over the years, right? But sometimes he says some things that are a little unusual, right? So you go to the supermarket, right, and you're getting things that are going to be good to throw on the grill, right? And you think pineapple, oh, pineapple's great. We can butcher a pineapple. That grills up well. And your cousin says, I never eat pineapples. They're too liberal for me. Now, you know that a pineapple, because of the kind of thing it is not the kind of thing that can have political views. So it can't be a liberal, right? So you think your cousin is, saying one of his unusual things, right? Another kind of category mistake, simplest, that's sort of the simplest kind of category mistake. The most famous example of a category mistake is, say you take your cousin to the to see your college, right? It's closed down now because of COVID, right? But let's say it's later on in the future whenever it's open, right? And you take your cousin around, you see all the classrooms, you meet your teachers, you see students. You get lost in the giant parking lot and everything. You take the whole tour of the campus, and you ask your cousin, well, what do you think? And cousin says, it's all the library and the cafeteria and all the students and the teachers and everything. Well, where was the college? I really wanted to see the college, right? Well, you just saw the college. A college is not the kind of thing that can be something in addition to all of those things, right? The word college just refers to that aggregate of things, right? And to expect that the college is something over and above all of that is expecting the college to have a characteristic that it couldn't possibly have. It's expecting it's confusing the logical type of thing that a college could be, right? Imagine a time whenever we have baseball again. You take your cousin to a baseball game, and you see the Cardinals beat the Cubs, as they often do, right? At the best of times. And so they beat the Cubs. The bottom of the ninth inning, it's tied. It's the bottom of the ninth inning. Yadier Molina hits a grand slam home run. The team comes together, and they manage to defeat their hated rivals, the Cubs, right? And your cousin says, well, that was a great game, but I was really hoping to see team spirit. I didn't see, where was the team spirit? I saw all the, I saw the players coming together and working hard, right? But where was the team spirit, right? Or you can play this game. Another example is, maybe you get to go. You get to go to meet the after the game. You get to go. Pardon me.